I want to start with three disclaimers. The first is that tales of municipal or community accomplishment tend to gather luster the further you are from home. And I'm very far from home. So we've probably been both more and less successful than it's probably going to sound. We'll see. The second is that in my experience working in a variety of places, each place has to make its own successes. So this is not presented as a prescription or as a template. The third is that if you get one message from this at all, it's that more can be changed than maybe you thought, which is the message I give to visitors to Portland all the time. It's not about doing what we did, it's recognizing that you can do things too and big changes can occur. So those are three disclaimers to frame all this. In writing this paper, let me first tell you about the presentation. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to tell you the main points of my paper, because I figure, I might not get to them. So I figure I'll give them to you at the beginning. And then in general, the way the paper is structured is it talks about context, the Oregon context. We'll go over a little bit of that. It talks about the program, how we plan in Oregon, some of the results from that planning. And I got to say, one of the advantages of writing about Oregon, one of the fortunate things is we've been written about a lot. So there's actually a literature on the Oregon program that's helpful. And then some of the lessons learned. And so I'm going to start with the contextual part because this kind of relates to something we talked about yesterday, transferability. I was so delighted to see contextual pieces in the presentations yesterday because, we as planners scholars often focus on best practice, but best practice tends to have the context shorn off. It gets described as smart growth, or it gets described as light rail, or it gets described as transit-oriented development or new urbanism, but fundamentally, these things really don't mean much out of the context within which they spring, and so that's an important part of the Oregon program. The paper that I wrote kind of started from the kind of observation that I made in actually kind of reading a book that a colleague of mine had written about the Oregon program. Cy Adler has recently written a book on the kind of political origins of the Oregon planning program. And the thing that struck me about that book is that, in Oregon, as in most US states, the state gave away its authority to say much about planning about 100 years ago. The very beginning of the 20th century, the states began to delegate their authority to do planning to cities and to counties. And that ever since, the states have been in a struggle to reclaim the ability to have something to say about the planning that goes on at cities and counties. In essence, it's been a kind of 100-year struggle to reclaim scale. And you can really see that in the context of the Oregon system. In Oregon, the state gave the power to plan and zone to cities in the 1920s, to counties in the 1940s. And then beginning in the 1940s, the state tried to essentially reassert its interest in what was happening to farmland. Because, as we'll see in a minute, the history of Oregon and its economy and its institutions really can be couched in terms of its service to the resource economy of a very large watershed, the Columbia River watershed. And so as a consequence, particularly in the middle part of the 20th century, Oregon's economy, its prosperity, its prospects in many ways, its politics, had a lot to do with what was happening with farmland and forest land, and the impact of post-World War II urbanization on farmland and forest land caused the state to begin to take a number of steps to try and get counties to protect farmland resources. And that kind of leads us up to where we are in the present day. So basically the main points of the paper, after giving away planning authority, the state's been trying to kind of reassert its interest in the scale of the state for a long time. And Andreas, we're going to get to this notion of, well, what is a state? Because I think that's a fundamentally interesting question. Planning in Oregon is really evidence of a continuum of effort. This is a story that unfolds over 100 years. This is not a story that basically occurred with the passage of legislation in 1973, which we will look at nonetheless. There is a strong connection in Oregon between the landscape and the planning that we do and why we do it and kind of what we've done. What I think we've been able to kind of demonstrate in Oregon, I think this fits into the themes that Zorisha and Garrett have kind of launched us with, is that there's a real necessity for real and accountable relationships among these scales. And if they exist, that amazing things can happen. So let's start with some contextual information. Oregon is kind of, it's like a secondary place. We're kind of most easily known as that place between California and Washington. It's kind of, who we are, where we are. The state basically can be divided into two parts. This is the Cascade Mountain Range that runs north to south. This is the Pacific Ocean. The city of Portland is right there, kind of in the language of Anna Whiston Spurn. It's this granite garden at the top of the Willamette Valley. East of the Cascade Mountains, it's very dry. It's very arid. It's high desert. It's kind of, the west, kind of writ large. This part of Oregon, we're part of the northern temperate rainforest, which runs from northern California all the way up to southeastern Alaska. So it's kind of a big ecological unit. Taking a bit of a tour from kind of west to east. This is the Oregon coast, volcanic headlands coming down into the ocean. Inland valleys, very fertile. Where we are in Portland is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in North America. It was a material culture that was made out of the materials, of course, in the landscape, which were not marble. And so as a consequence, the evidence of over 12,000 years of human habitation is, kind of hard to find, kind of in a, I guess, more traditional sense. But fundamentally, this has been a very abundant place for people to live for a very long time. And continues to be so to the current day. This is the city of Portland, kind of nestled in those valleys with the Cascade Mountains in the distance. Although this is a picture taken with a telephoto lens, which makes it look like that mountain is about 24,000 feet tall. But interestingly, this is one of the most important postcards of, sold in the entire Portland metropolitan region. I actually went to the largest wholesaler of postcards to find out how were we being perceived, what images of our region were people buying, and this was it. And this is another kind of part of this image that's really important for understanding Portland and Oregon, is that when you look at the most popular postcards and the way that people describe the city, it's not about looking at the skyline, it's looking at the mountains behind the skyline or the trees behind the city. It's the city in nature. I mean, that's very much kind of the legacy of Portland. When you get across the mountains to the eastern side, this is actually down in the southeastern part of the state, but it's dry, arid, kind of and big. So this is what population distribution in the state of Oregon kind of looks like. Oregon is a population of about 3.8 million. So this is where the Cascade Mountains are, and about 80 to 85% of the population of the entire state is located here within about 10 miles of an interstate freeway that runs 300 miles from the northern border to the southern border, okay? So, in essence, the population of Ireland is about 4.6 million, something like that. The area of Oregon from the mountains to the Pacific Ocean are about the same as the area of Ireland. And like Ireland, this is a very wet, kind of part of the state, so there's a lot of similarities. This part of the state, very depopulated, very few people per square mile. The kind of part of the west that this is a part of is one of the least populated places in the entire United States. But this is a tremendously long distance. And so yesterday, Andreas was kind of asking these questions about, the nature of states and the way that we define them. And this is an absolutely good question to raise, because fundamentally, what does this have to do with, kind of a common community of interest, a single region, a set of factors that begin to describe one thing? And fundamentally, ecologically, economically, politically, culturally, historically, even back to the history of the native peoples, these are very different places, And so our state essentially is a 19th century artifact, which institutionally is absolutely essential to us today in the 21st century. So some colleagues of mine and I from Oregon State University and the University of Oregon have developed a project looking at what makes the state a state in the 21st century. And what we're kind of finding is that over time, the economy and politics have pulled apart pretty substantially. Rural Oregon is less connected to Portland and the Willamette Valley than ever before in the history of the state of Oregon, the Anglo history of Portland. And so consequently, this kind of notion of institutionally, where are we headed, it takes on kind of real meaning and urgency, because to some degree, we have land use planning program that covers this entire area and is administered, from the state capital in the center of the Willamette Valley. But the way the state works is beginning to change before our very eyes. So stay tuned. Things continue to shift. We are currently in the process of trying to find ways of knitting the state together and coming up with an agenda that begins to link the wide range of interests in what is still the state of Oregon. This is kind of a generalized land use map, and again, the other basically refers to Indian reservations, which essentially are nations unto themselves. National parks, this is Crater Lake, for those of you who wondered about it. Maps like this are always kind of so stunning to me because they kind of represent everything around the state as like polar ice cap, it's just all kind of white and gone. But fundamentally what you can see is that most of the population activity is focused here, and the state is really comprised of a wide range of environments and interests. The other thing about the state of Oregon, contextually, that's important is that we're a long way from Washington, D.C. It's all the way over here, and as a consequence, our relationship with the nation is quite different. 52% of the state of Oregon is owned by the federal government, which is unusual, right? In that basically, until you get to this point, federal ownership of land is pretty sparse. But when you get into this part of the West, there's a profound federal presence at the local level, which is unlike what is experienced in this part of the nation, where the federal presence is basically filtered through different layers of government and institutions. The way that Oregon's been regarded by the nation over time is kind of, consistent with this map that was made in the 1930s by the Natural Resources Board, which essentially, portrayed Oregon as a territory of, jumping fish, tall trees, orchards. This was like a resource colony serving the needs of the nation. And it's interesting. It's a kind of a view of Oregon and its role in the nation that has framed our efforts to the current day. Now, one of the things that's useful about this is that all of this is to suggest that unlike the cities, there's only one ship that comes to the entire continent. It's coming to the East Coast, and it's only probably coming from one place, right? It's Dublin. But, basically, what this is kind of telling you is that this is all marginal, right? And one of the real advantages of being from a marginal place is you can do whatever you want. It's real difficult when you're in the center of things, and so. If you look at the economy of the Portland metropolitan region, for example, we have, really one, maybe two Fortune 500 companies. The Fortune 500 company we're best known for is Nike, swoosh. And basically, what that means is that unlike communities further to the east with kind of more historic ties to the, kind of manufacturing and, kind of industrial economy of the nation, fundamentally, we're not a Fortune 500 town. It means we are organized in much smaller pieces. There's a lot more space in between that has given people a chance to play. Okay, well, the modern era of land use planning and the title of this paper, which is about the quilt and the struggle for scale, basically up until the 1960s, the state had made some half-hearted efforts to get counties involved in zoning farmland for protection. In the early 60s, the state instituted a program that would have allowed counties to create exclusive farm use zones, which would have given tremendous tax benefits to farmers. Few counties did that for a couple of reasons. One, they weren't really interested in planning, and two, if they gave exclusive farm use designation to farmers, they wouldn't be able to tax the farmland. So there was kind of a built-in disincentive to actually do that in a lot of ways. In the mid-60s, Oregon began to take some steps to address environmental issues, adopting Bottle Bill, Beach Bill, which essentially has preserved public access to the entire Pacific coast for all people, which is an amazing commitment on the part of the state in the United States context. And in 1969 adopted a requirement that all cities and counties adopt comprehensive land use plans, but without any accountability, without any statement about what was expected or kind of how it would be enforced, with a vague assertion that the state would step in and do the plan for the community if the community didn't do it itself. But fundamentally, the state had zero interest in doing that, was totally uninterested in doing that, did not want to get involved in local planning. But then a number of interesting things happened. The late 1960s, the advent of major environmental legislation at the federal level, Earth Day in 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act, all of a sudden this kind of awakening about environmental concerns. And so all of a sudden the notion that there would be a more fundamental connection to address, between state and local, to address the issues of sprawl and development, really began to kind of fit the times. And so yesterday we heard about the John DeGrove waves of state level planning. We were part of the first wave, which was a consequence of the environmental movement, which was kind of about addressing land resources, a fundamental environmental issue. And so this was a big moment. And what Oregon adopted in 1973 was a statewide planning program. But Andreas, this is for you. The exclamation mark remains. There is no state plan.
Have you tried to publish this?
Well, I put it into my paper. We'll see if I succeed, okay? Yeah, we'll see if I succeed. There's no state plan, which means that the way that the state planning program works in Oregon is not that we have a band of planners at the state level who are essentially creating a comprehensive plan for that enormous territory, hundreds of 96,000 square miles, 255,000 square kilometers. We're not doing that. Instead, what we depend on are the comprehensive plans developed by all 36 counties and all 242 cities to add up to a quilt that covers every square inch of the state. And that all of those plans are developed according to goals adopted by the state, and that all of those plans are reviewed by the state for consistency with those goals. Furthermore, that by law, zoning must implement the comprehensive plan. So there's no ambiguity. It's not like it would be nice to be in proximity to a plan, or maybe if a plan was in the next room, that would be okay. There must be a demonstrable relationship between the zoning and the implementation of the plan. And furthermore, and this is the kind of important part, urbanization focused inside urban growth boundaries. In a lot of states, when you have an important resource like farmland, what they'll do is draw a line around the farmland and say, here's the important farmland, we got to preserve it. And everything else kind of becomes a free fire zone. What happened in the Oregon context was the state essentially directed the counties and the cities to draw a line around urban areas and say, contain the urban areas, and everything else will be presumed to be preserved for farm and forest use. Now there's we never get to start with a blank slate as planners. A lot of decisions have been made in resource land, which had already, kind of set the things in motion to convert farm and forest land to other kinds of things. But fundamentally, what the program did is it essentially established the expectation that we would contain urban land, make conscious decisions about adding more urban land to that supply, and assume that everything outside those boundaries would be used for farm and forest use, or managed to be sympathetic with farm and forest use. These are the goals. I'm not going to go over them right now. One important point to realize, we haven't added any new goals since 1976. So there's been tremendous stability in the titles here, but these goals have been profoundly amended and modified over time, along with the administrative rules and along with a long list of litigation that's occurred to define and refine and clarify what the language actually meant. In terms of institutional relationships, this is the way we usually draw it in the United States. The citizens are on top. They elect the legislature, they elect the governor. The governor is kind of in charge of the administrative apparatus. The legislature passes the laws of the state, which have delegated planning powers to cities and to counties. Only cities and counties can do comprehensive planning, but we have these interesting kind of offshoots. Metro in the metropolitan area is the only directly elected regional government in the United States. And it actually has, this is what's astonishing in the American context, the power to require city and county comprehensive plans to change, to be consistent with regional functional plans. Not regional comprehensive plans, but functional plans. And one of those regional functional plans in the Portland area is a regional urban growth boundary. It's not managed by each of the 25 cities and 3 counties in Metro's jurisdiction. It's managed by Metro on behalf of the metropolitan land market. There is a lot of information out there about the impact of the Oregon program. What I try and do in my paper is cover 3 important parts of that. One is the success to some degree that we've had with using urban growth boundaries and focusing growth in urban areas. The second is our how we've fared in protecting farmland, another kind of important impetus for the Oregon program. And then third,
Essentially the fact that despite what looks like this kind of integrated system of planning and everybody kind of working together, there's tremendous controversy that remains, and it's at the very basic levels of the values in the United States around private property and the way the property rights movement has affected the Oregon system in recent years. But quickly, a couple lessons learned. Planning matters. The plans have changed things and made a difference in the way the state operates and the way the state looks. Does it mean that sprawl is ended, you know, and that everyone has housing and that they can afford, and that farmers are essentially not affected by speculative investments in land? Absolutely not. We have all the issues in America and more, but the planning has made a difference in the Oregon context. That things take time. That basically this is a program and a set of ideas that were set in motion really in about 1947, and 60 years later we're still kind of working on it, and we'll be working on it for 60 more. The controversy never goes away, which is really interesting. I think maybe the most interesting thing about that is that we've had relative stability in the nature of the program. The institutions have run it. It's about collaboration and compromise. Coalitions have been very important. All sectors are involved in the Oregon land use discussion. Public, private, nonprofit, NGO, and that continues to be the case to this day. The landscape is what keeps us honest. You don't move to Oregon to get rich, you know? I mean, if you want to get rich, go to Houston, or go to Los Angeles, go to Dublin, you know, go to some place where money is flowing like Guinness, you know? I mean, but you know, basically people move to Oregon and to Portland because they want to live well. It kind of self-selects for people who are looking for that kind of thing. And fundamentally, even though we have urban, rural, urban, suburban, you know, Democrat, Republican, the thing that kind of keeps us honest is the landscape and the relationship to the landscape. A lot more can be said about that. And then finally, many, many issues remain. We are working on climate change, you know, working on regional planning. We're working on essentially the very definition of terms in the Oregon program itself. What is agricultural land? You know, what is industrial land? What do these terms mean anymore? And of course, they change over time. And so we're still kind of working on a lot of the details, and it's a struggle, it's a dialogue. So thanks.